Welcome to DarkVerse. I'm Isaac Nightshade. Tonight's story is called The Spinney Never Sleeps. When the trees lean closer at night, they're not growing. They're listening, they're remembering. Eleanor Marsh inherits a cottage she doesn't recall, in a forest that remembers too much. She thought the spinney was just overgrown woods, but it's more like a mouth, and she's already between its teeth. At first, it's just dreams, faint footsteps, photographs that shouldn't exist. But the deeper she walks, the more the forest remembers her name, even the one she forgot. Some places aren't haunted by ghosts. They're haunted by versions of you that didn't stay gone. The spinney never sleeps. You're not just reading, you're already returning. Chapter 1. The Letterbox. It arrived on a Wednesday. The sky outside Eleanor Marsh's flat was a solid slate, the kind of oppressive gray that muffled sound and stilled motion. Rain hovered but never fell, suspended in the air like breath held too long. She stood in her hallway in her socks, staring down at the envelope resting silently on the doormat, as if it had slipped through without sound or contact. No postman, no footsteps, just there. It was heavy, not in weight, but in suggestion. A cream-colored envelope, coarsely textured. The paper looked handmade, like something from another century. No postage, no stamp. Only a wax seal, dried blood red, pressed with an insignia she didn't recognize. A curled shape, like a fern, spiraling inward, or a snake swallowing its tail. She touched it and drew back. Cold. Unnaturally so. Eleanor wasn't expecting mail. She hadn't received anything handwritten in months. Her life, contained within small routines, checked boxes, blinking notifications, did not make space for wax-sealed mysteries. She should have thrown it out, or at least waited. But her fingers were already sliding beneath the seal, cracking it open. Inside, a letter. Legal, typed, perfunctory. And yet it felt off. To Ms. Eleanor Marsh, we regret to inform you of the passing of Mr. Alaric Marsh. You have been named sole beneficiary of his estate, included one cottage located at the border of Hemsley Spinney, Southeast County. Instructions for access and key enclosed. Please attend at your earliest convenience. She read it twice before realizing she wasn't breathing. Alaric Marsh. The name stirred something, faint and flitting. Not a memory. Not quite a feeling. Wet leaves. The smell of stone. A man's laughter, distant and echoing. A story told too late at night. Uncle, the letter had said, but she remembered no uncle. Her parents had never spoken of one. No photos, no Christmas cards, no family tree scribbled in pencil. And yet, the name vibrated in her chest like a struck bell. Familiar in the way dreams sometimes are, real but warped. There was something else inside the envelope. A small brass key, dulled with green corrosion, wrapped in flaking black felt. It stuck to her fingers. The key was old, maybe ancient. She should have called someone, a solicitor, her mother. But she didn't. Instead, she placed the key on her kitchen counter, washed her hands twice, and spent the rest of the evening on the couch, staring at the blank television screen. She didn't turn it on. The reflection it offered was enough. She didn't remember falling asleep. The next morning, Eleanor was packed. Her overnight bag stood by the door. Her phone showed a saved destination she didn't remember searching. Marsh Cottage, Southeast County. A set of printed directions waited beside her keys. She blinked at them. Had she booked a train? The shower hissed in the background, still damp with steam. Her coffee cup was rinsed and turned upside down in the drying rack. Her coat was draped neatly over her arm. She'd prepared herself without knowing. The train station was unusually quiet for a weekday, or perhaps she had simply forgotten what noise felt like. Her boots echoed faintly on the concrete. When she sat on the train, she checked her texts. Nothing. No missed call. No messages. It was as if the world had paused in anticipation of something it didn't want to name. The journey passed in a haze. The countryside grew rougher the farther south she went. The fields more erratic, the trees pressed tighter together. She thought she saw shapes, between the trunks, A figure, perhaps, watching. By the time she stepped off the final platform, the light was fading. The air felt old, thick with moisture and leaf mold. A single taxi idled outside the station. The driver, a weathered man with eyes that refused to meet hers, said only, "Spinney, is it?" when she gave him the address. Not Marsh Cottage, not the house, just Spinney, as though it were a destination in itself, or a warning. It was nearly dark when they arrived. The road had long since crumbled into gravel, then mud. Brambles scraped the car doors like fingernails. The trees pressed in on both sides, not tall but dense, their branches heavy with dew, their trunks gnarled and black. The forest had a way of growing into itself, turning every path into a tunnel. There were no bird, no wind. The cottage emerged like something half-remembered. Squat, stone, slanted slightly forward like it was listening. The roof bowed under the weight of moss and rot. A thin stream of smoke curled from the crooked chimney. She didn't ask who lit the fire. The taxi pulled away without a word, tires slipping on the wet leaves. She was alone. The key was in her pocket, warm now. It slid into the door's iron lock with a quiet click. The door opened before she turned the knob. Inside, the air was still, not musty as she expected, but dry, preserved, as though the house had been waiting for her, not decaying in her absence. The wallpaper was faded and peeling, revealing darker lines beneath. Marks, or perhaps words, drawn in some other time. A clock ticked in the front room, but the hands pointed to 12. They always pointed to 12. She dropped her bag in the narrow hall. It landed with a dull thud. There was no electricity, only oil lamps flickering gently on side tables and mantels. They burned steadily, casting shadows and shapes that didn't quite match the furniture. The shadows moved when she wasn't watching. In the upstairs bedroom, she found a mirror veiled in black gauze. She pulled it off and stared at her reflection for too long. Something in her eyes looked off-kilter, hungrier. The corners of her mouth twitched like they wanted to smile. Downstairs, she found the fireplace already burning. A fire, alive and crackling, though no matches or logs were in sight. The hearth smelled of damp stone and sweet rot. She sat in the old armchair, its cushions sinking beneath her. Outside, the spinney murmured, "Not wind, something else." A collective whisper, too low to catch, too loud to ignore. She closed her eyes for what felt like seconds. When she opened them, it was full night. The fire had gone out, and someone, something, had placed the key back on her lap. Wet, cold, as if freshly pulled from the bottom of a well. Chapter 2. Past the Fence. The Spinney Never Sleeps. The morning came too quickly. Though Eleanor couldn't be sure she'd slept, sunlight didn't quite reach the cottage. It filtered in weakly through the streaked windows, pale and disinterested. Outside, the trees had crept closer. She was certain of it. Yesterday, there had been a strip of clearing between the cottage and the tree line, enough to breathe. Now the branches were nearly brushing the rear wall, as though the forest had inhaled during the night. She stood at the back door with a cup of tea she didn't remember brewing. It had gone cold in her hand. The gate at the edge of the garden, the one made of twisted iron with curling leaves and thorns carved into its bars, was wide open. She remembered closing it, locking it even. There had been a bolt, slightly rusted, that scraped across the latch. Now it dangled loose, swinging gently. She told herself it was wind, a trick of air, pressure, a poorly hung gate. She said these things in her mind like reciting a prayer, not for belief but for control. And still, the trees leaned in. She walked to the village around noon. The path was overgrown but worn, as though used regularly by invisible feet. It twisted through the forest's edge before spilling out into the narrow high street of Hemsley. The village looked like a painting smudged by time. Tidy brick houses with soot-dusted chimneys, a leaning pub with a sign too faded to read, and a grocer with a bell that rang when she stepped inside. The sound startled her. It sounded like a scream clipped short. The grocer, a gray woman with thin lips and thick glasses, gave her a look as if Eleanor had wandered into a room mid-conversation and interrupted something important. She asked for bread, tea, matches. The woman nodded once, turned, and returned moments later with the items, wrapped in brown paper without comment. "Do you know anything about the cottage near the Spinney?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice casual. The woman's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the direction Eleanor had come. Her mouth twitched. "The Marsh place?" Eleanor nodded. "Should stay out of the woods," the woman said, "especially after dark." There was something unsettling about the way she said it. Not warning, not concern, just protocol. As if repeating a phrase taught long ago. In the pub, it was no different. The barkeep, a heavy-set man with a deep furrow between his eyes, poured her a drink without asking what she wanted. The glass smelled of vinegar and wood smoke. He stared past her as he spoke. "Someone's always coming back. Never lasts." "Back?" He didn't answer. A child, thin, grimy, clutching a ragged doll, watched her from the corner of the room. When Eleanor met her gaze, the girl smiled. It was a strange, empty smile, too wide and slow, as if her face didn't quite remember how to form it. "You live in the house," the girl said. "He doesn't like that." Eleanor opened her mouth to ask who, but the girl had already turned and slipped out the side door, the doll dragging behind her like a dead limb. She left the village soon after, the bag of supplies pressed tight against her chest. Every glance from the locals had felt like a measurement, as if they were calculating how long she would last. The narrow path back to the cottage had darkened, though. It wasn't yet evening. The trees whispered to each other, a language of creaking limbs and sighing leaves. Back at the cottage, she tried to make sense of things. She set the clocks again, one in the kitchen, one in the hallway, the old grandfather clock in the living room. She wound their springs, adjusted their hands, and watched them tick, steady, loud, marking time with false confidence, but they never changed. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The hands remained fixed, the ticking now hollow, a pantomime of time. She flipped on the radio, static, tried the light switch. Nothing. Her phone displayed the wrong date, April 17th, 1991. She stared at it, refreshed the screen. Nothing changed. Her hands trembled slightly. She wrote it off as poor reception, a glitch, anything but what it felt like. She didn't remember sitting down, but at some point, she was in the armchair again. Fire unlit, the room colder than it had any right to be. She didn't remember falling asleep. The sound woke her, soft, slow, rhythmic, footsteps. Outside. Eleanor sat up, heart hammering so hard she thought it might rattle the windows. She held her breath, ears straining. The sound came again. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause, just beyond the tree line. Slow. Measured. She crossed to the window, peeled back the curtain. The garden was empty, but the gate, still open. Wider now. The path leading into the woods was bathed in moonlight, the leaves silver and still. And there, just at the edge, movement, a shape, a man, maybe, just beyond the reach of the light. She blinked, and he was gone. She shut the curtain quickly, too quickly. Her hand was trembling. It could have been an animal, she told herself. A deer, a poacher, a dream. She didn't believe any of it. She crept upstairs, each stair groaning underfoot. The bedroom felt colder than the rest of the house. A wind pushed through the cracked window, though she didn't remember opening it. She closed and latched it, then backed away from it slowly. In the mirror, her reflection hesitated. Just for a second, a pause that shouldn't have been there. She turned away quickly, heart thudding, a thin sheen of sweat forming at the base of her neck. She tried to sleep. The pacing began again at midnight. This time it circled the house. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Then a pause, then closer. Crunch. Her breath caught. Crunch. Something scraped against the back wall just beneath the window. A long dragging sound like fingers or nails raking across stone. She pulled the covers to her chin. Rationality dissolved in the dark. She imagined every shadow in the house growing teeth. She imagined the trees pressing their faces against the glass. She imagined the gate swinging open, not from wind, but from invitation. And the pacing continued, back and forth, around and around. It didn't stop. At some point, she rose slowly and crept to the window. She peered through the slit in the curtains. The woods were still again, but in the center of the garden, directly in the pale moonlight, someone had left a small object. She strained her eyes. A doll, ragged, mud-caked. It looked just like the one the girl in the pub had been holding, and it was facing the cottage, facing her. Chapter 3, The Man in the Moss. The Spinney Never Sleeps. Eleanor stepped past the gate just after noon. The air was wrong for daytime, thicker than it should have been, too still. The usual sounds of forest life, birds, insects, wind through leaves, had been muted to a low, background murmur, like breathing through cloth. And the light wasn't sunlight exactly, more a dim filtering, as if the canopy above were made of stained glass rather than foliage. Still, she walked. The path into the spinney wasn't clear, so much as implied. There were no signs, no obvious tracks, just a soft, instinctive tug in the chest. Her boots sank slightly into the mossy earth. Dampness soaked into the fabric despite the clear skies. The trees, gnarled and bowed as if under some ancient burden, stood too close together. They leaned inward like quiet conspirators. Eleanor looked back once. The cottage was gone, swallowed by bark and vine. The only sound was the rhythmic shuffle of her own footsteps and the occasional creak. Low, almost metallic, like something twisting slowly in the undergrowth. She didn't know how long she walked. Time unraveled here. Even her shadow refused to stretch consistently, flickering at her feet in the wrong direction. Once she stopped to rest her hand against the trunk of a tree, and the bark pulsed faintly under her palm, warm and damp like living flesh. She pulled away sharply. Eventually the trees opened slightly, forming a clearing dense with green-gold light. And in the center, the well. It looked older than anything she had ever seen. A circular wall of lichen-covered stones, the mortar crumbling. The mouth of it was sealed shut by a rough wooden lid, warped and blistered, hammered in place with rusted nails the size of her fingers. Strips of wool, dirty, knotted, sun-bleached, were tied tightly across the top in crisscrossing patterns. Some had rotted to threads. Others were wet, though no rain had fallen. She didn't move closer. There was something loud in the silence around it. The well seemed to exhale, a low vibration, a hum beneath the soil. Eleanor stared at it and felt something watching her from underneath. Something that knew her. Her arms prickled with goose flesh. A faint scent hung in the air, sweet and fetid, like rotting flowers or damp fur left in the sun. Then just beyond the far edge of the clearing, he appeared. The man. He was facing her, half swallowed by a slope of moss. From the waist down, he looked embedded, like he'd risen from the earth or had never truly left it. His suit was dark and out of place, shiny and water-stained, as if he'd drowned in it. His face, too narrow, too long, was clean, but not alive. His eyes, black, wet, wide, and he was smiling. Not broadly, not menacingly. The smile was small, close-lipped, private, like he knew something about her. Something she had forgotten. Eleanor froze. Her first thought, he's been here the whole time. Her second, he is not supposed to move, but he might. She blinked. He was gone. The clearing was empty, but in the moss near where he'd stood, footprints remained. Deep, perfectly shaped, still dark and damp with soil, leading away, toward her, toward the cottage. Eleanor didn't remember running. or how long it took to get back. The forest warped in reverse as she fled. Trees, shifting location mid-blink, branches clawing at her coat. Once she tripped over a root and landed hard, her palms grinding into gravel that hadn't been there a moment earlier. She tasted iron in her mouth. Her ankle throbbed. The cottage greeted her like an open grave. The gate, still open, wider now. The front door hung ajar, though she was certain she'd closed it behind her. Locked it. Twice. Inside, the air had changed. The smell of moss followed her in. Faint. Creeping. She moved through the house room by room, checking cupboards, corners, under the stairs. Each time she turned, she expected to find him there, half submerged in her hallway, wet-eyed, smiling. She found no one, but something was different. The grandfather clock in the living room, still stuck at 12, was ticking faster now. Frenzied almost. Tick, 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 tick. She reached to stop it, and it halted before she touched it. Dead silent again. In the bathroom mirror, her face appeared slightly tilted, though she stood straight. Her eyes didn't blink when she did. She turned away. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. There were no footsteps, no pacing. Not this time. Just the whisper of wind in the chimney that occasionally shaped itself into syllables. The kind that almost made words. And then, at 3:17 a.m., though her clocks still claimed it was 12, she heard it. A single knock. Soft, precise. She waited, then another. She rose slowly, hard in her throat, and crept to the landing. The knock came again. Not at the door. At the window. The one at the end of the hallway. The one that overlooked the rear garden. The gate was still open. Moonlight glazed the clearing behind the cottage. There, standing at the far edge of the garden, just where the spinney began to thicken again, was a figure. Tall. Still. His suit gleamed faintly like oil on water. His head tilted to one side as if listening. The moss clung to his legs even now. It never let go. And he was smiling. Chapter 4. Photographs that weren't taken. The Spinney Never Sleeps. She'd been hearing the creaking for days. A faint rhythmic groan beneath the boards of the cottage. Subtle at first, like the settling of an old house. But it had become more insistent. Not random. Patterned. Like someone was walking just below the floor. Or scratching gently. Waiting. Eleanor told herself it was the pipes. Or perhaps a rodent. Something explainable. But her eyes kept drifting to the floorboard near the hearth, where the rug didn't quite lie flat. A corner curled up just enough to catch her toe whenever she passed. That morning, before the sun could rise high enough to reach the windows, she pulled the rug back. The floorboard was loose. It came up easily, too easily, like it had been opened before. The smell beneath it rose up immediately. Dry dust, old paper, and something else. Something organic. Not rot exactly, but memory. Nestled in the shallow cavity beneath the plank was a shoebox, the kind sold in department stores decades ago, with brittle corners and faded script across the lid. Claremont and Sons Dress Oxfords. A child's scrawl marked the side in red crayon, "Keep out EM." She stared at it for a long time before touching it. Her initials. That was her handwriting. She was almost sure of it. But she had no memory of ever writing those letters. No memory of this box, this floorboard, this place. And yet the unease in her chest was not born from surprise. It was recognition. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside, photographs. Hundreds of them. Polaroids, their white borders yellowed with age. The topmost image showed a girl, 6 or 7, standing at the edge of a forest. She was thin, with long brown hair and a pale blue coat. Her posture was stiff, her expression uncertain. Behind her stood a tall man in a wool overcoat. His face was indistinct, blurred by movement or decay, but even in that smear of shadow there was something wrong. A tension in the limbs, a tilt to the head, like he wasn't looking at the child, but through her. Eleanor turned the photo over. In pencil, me and Uncle Alaric. Spinney 1991? She dropped it. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she reached for another. Then another. All the same girl. Always the same place. Sometimes alone, sometimes with the man. Sometimes the man was closer. Once, his hand rested on the child's shoulder. Eleanor looked at the angle of the fingers. Too long, too tight, like they were rooting into her. She scanned the girl's face again. It was her. Not quite. The shape of the eyes, the tilt of the mouth. A childhood she didn't remember having. A version of herself she'd never been. Her throat was dry. Her thoughts swam. Was this a prank? Fabricated memories? Some twisted artifact left behind by a man who knew how to unsettle? But then, at the very bottom of the stack, she found the one that stopped her breath entirely. It was a recent photo, taken in daylight, crisp, focused. Eleanor, now as she was, standing beside the moss-wrapped well in the spinney, her expression was blank. Her arms hung at her sides. Behind her, slightly to the left, something leaned out from the trees. She stared at it for a long time. The figure in the woods was half caught by the camera, obscured by shadow. A suggestion of a suit, a. When they opened, the world had changed. She stood barefoot in the spinney. The air was cold and wet. Her feet sank into the moss, deeper than they should have. The trees towered above, bent at impossible angles, each one leaning inward to form a kind of cathedral. Moonlight dripped through the branches like water. He was there, the man in the moss, standing impossibly still just ahead. His head tilted, smile fixed. His voice came without lips moving. Do you know what we bury when we forget? Eleanor couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her arms felt full of stones. Photographs are little graves, he whispered. Tiny coffins. Little deaths. She wanted to scream. Her jaw wouldn't open. He stepped forward. The moss beneath him bloomed as he walked. Flowers of bone and teeth opened along his path. You were here before, he said. You asked me to help you forget. I said no, so you buried me instead. His smile grew, too wide, splitting the face like paper tearing. But now, he said, you remember. She woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat. The covers twisted around her like ropes. The house was silent. The box still lay beside her on the floor, its photos spread across the carpet. Except one was missing. The final one. The one of her at the well. She stood and searched the room. Under the bed, beneath the rug, nothing. Then she noticed the back door, wide open. Wet footprints led across. The kitchen floor, small, bare, not hers. And just inside the threshold, placed neatly on the floor like a gift, a Polaroid, fresh, still damp. In it, Eleanor was asleep in her bed, and the man in the moss was sitting in the chair across from her, watching, smiling. Chapter 5, The Hollowing. The Spinney Never Sleeps. Sleep was no longer something Eleanor drifted into. It happened to her like a fainting spell. One moment she'd be stirring tea or staring through the window at the edge of the spinney, and the next she'd come to with hours missing, her jaw clenched and her eyes wet with tears she hadn't felt full. She told herself it was stress, a disruption in circadian rhythm, the body adjusting to a new environment. But her reflection disagreed. It had started subtly, a soft fuzz around the edges of her mirror image, like fog creeping over glass. But over the past few days, if they were days, it had deepened. Her reflection now lagged ever so slightly, like an old video buffering. Sometimes it blinked a moment too late, or didn't blink at all. Today, standing in the upstairs bathroom, Eleanor found herself holding eye contact with the version of her in the mirror for nearly 2 minutes before realizing she wasn't breathing. She opened her mouth to gasp, So did the reflection, but not in perfect sync. A second behind. A beat late. Always. She closed her eyes, counted to 5, and opened them again. The mirror was still. Normal. Just her. But even then, she wasn't sure. The voices began on a Wednesday, or what she assumed was Wednesday. The clocks had all stopped keeping time again. Everyone fixed at a different moment, as though capturing fragments of a scattered narrative. Noon, 3:44, midnight. The first voice came from the sink. She had been washing her hands, just a habitual rinse, though she didn't recall touching anything dirty, when the water turned warm without her adjusting the tap. Not just warm, body warm, human, and then a whisper, soft, feminine, right at the edge of sound. "You have dirt in your lungs." She dropped the soap. It rolled down the porcelain basin and stopped at the drain. She didn't sleep that night, or if she did, the dreams were so near to waking, they felt sewn into her waking mind. A low, endless hum beneath her ribs. Words she couldn't translate, spoken in a dialect of root and stone. By the third night, she began speaking aloud, not consciously but in fragments, half-thoughts full of apologies and warnings. "I didn't mean to leave you there. He said I could stay if I forgot." They listened through the water. Each time she caught herself mid-sentence, there would be a pause, a long, weighted silence, as if something just beyond the wall had been answering. The house had grown colder, but not in a way that could be solved with blankets. It was a deep cold, seeping in from beneath, radiating from the stone of the foundation. She noticed it in her joints, her teeth, her scalp. And still, the gate stayed open. She checked it compulsively now, 5, 6 times a day. Each time she latched it, she returned to find it, hanging open again, wide as if something had walked through and not out. The cottage walls had begun to shift in her peripheral vision. Patterns emerged in the wallpaper she hadn't noticed before. Looping shapes, fern-like, spiral-etched. One night she followed them with her fingers and realized they formed a continuous path from the front door to her bedroom window. A trail or a root system. She tried to call someone, a friend, a voice from the world she'd left behind, but her phone was dead, lifeless no matter how long it charged. When she turned it over in her hand, she noticed a faint green smear across the back. Moss, thin, slick, like the residue of something recently touched. The next morning she woke on the floor, not in her bed, not in the chair. The floor. Her back ached. Her mouth tasted of iron and mud. As she sat up, disoriented, she saw that her hands were caked in dirt. Underneath her nails, soil, dark and damp. On her wrists, small scratches, as if from branches or bramble. Pine needles clung to the hem of her nightgown, sticky with sap. She stood slowly, knees shaking, and walked to the mirror. Her reflection looked back and smiled, just faintly, for an instant. Then her face returned to neutral. Eleanor staggered to the sink, turned on the tap. The water ran brown for 2 full seconds before clearing. When she closed her eyes to rinse her face, she heard a voice, clear and low. "He lives under your tongue now." She screamed then, not out of fear but out of frustration, a choked, cracked sound that barely escaped her throat. She wasn't losing her mind. She was gaining something, a new language, a second memory. Something had taken root inside her, beneath thought, beneath fear. Something older. The Spinney wasn't outside anymore. It was in her. That evening, if it was evening, she sat in the kitchen with every lamp on. Her hands were shaking too badly to hold her tea. The shoebox of Polaroids lay on the table beside her, but she didn't open it. Not tonight. She couldn't bear to see herself again in those strange, impossible memories. Instead, she stared at the back door. It remained shut, latched. For now, she spoke aloud, just to hear her voice, to remind herself she was still the only one here. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "What do you think you left here?" A pause, then from the faucet, the low gurgle of air in the pipes, or laughter. She pushed back from the table. Her chest ached. She felt hollowed, as though something had been scooping her out from the inside, softly over time. She lifted her nightgown and touched her belly. It felt cold, too cold. Something inside her shuddered. Not metaphor at all. At 3:44 a.m., she knew this now without looking, she woke again, not in her bed, but outside, in the tailored. His face was clearer now, too, though not quite right. His smile was wide, wider than any human's should be. He raised a hand, a slow beckoning motion. Eleanor didn't move, but her feet did. One step forward, then another. Behind her, the trees closed. Chapter 6, The Unremembered. The Spinney Never Sleeps. It had rained during the night, the kind of soft, all-consuming rain that didn't splatter or roar but soaked everything in its path like a slow, deliberate breath. The forest floor pulsed with it. The moss gleamed. Eleanor woke to condensation on the inside of the windows, her breath visible, her skin clammy. The back door was locked. Her feet were bare but clean. There were no pine needles in her bed. No, obvious evidence of another sleepwalking episode, and yet something was missing, not just from the cottage, but from her. A feeling, a fragment, like waking from a dream and knowing it had been important, but not being able to hold a single detail. She left the cottage late in the morning, heading toward the village with her collar turned up and her sleeves pulled over her wrists. Her clothes hung a little looser now. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten, or if she'd wanted to. The spinney followed her down the hill, even as she moved away from it. Every branch felt turned in her direction. Every leaf watched. She walked faster than she meant to. The village was much the same, but now it noticed her. The air shifted slightly when she entered the square. Conversations paused, windows darkened. A dog that had been lying beside a lamppost stood suddenly, whined, and trotted behind a bin. People did not speak to her, except the woman in the pub. She sat in the corner, same place as before, wrapped in an oversized cardigan with a fraying collar. Her eyes were watery and pale blue, the color of sea glass. She was drinking something dark from a chipped mug. Eleanor approached her slowly, almost ashamed. "Do you know me?" she asked. The woman's eyes didn't move. Her lips pressed together. Then softly, "You come here every few years. Always looking." "Looking for what?" Eleanor asked, her throat dry. The woman tilted her head. "Who, not what?" That word settled heavily. Eleanor swallowed. "Who?" But the woman didn't answer. She looked past Eleanor, toward the doorway of the pub. "He's not in there," she murmured. "He never is. He doesn't need doors." Eleanor sat down across from her, uninvited but unnoticed. Her hands shook slightly as she folded them. "You said I've been here before?" The woman nodded. "You always forget. That's the way of it. You go too far, you come back hollow. It lets you go because you asked it to, but you don't stay gone. I don't understand. You aren't supposed to." On her way out, a child tugged on her coat. She hadn't seen the girl come in. Thin, pale, the same one from before. Her hair was wet, clumped to her forehead, eyes too large for her face. The girl handed her something, a folded piece of paper, crumpled slightly in the middle. Then she turned and walked away without a word. Eleanor unfolded the drawing slowly. It was done in black crayon, scratchy lines heavy with pressure, a crude image of trees, crooked and wrong, surrounding a circle, the well at its center. A stick figure stood beside it, labeled with jagged letters, Eleanor. The figure was smiling. The well, though, was open. No lid, no wool, just a dark hole. From it, long black arms stretched upward, not touching her, not yet, but reaching. Eleanor didn't remember. Walking back to the cottage, the path blurred in her mind, her footsteps automatic. The sun was low now, burning weakly through the canopy. The gate was open again. The front door creaked when she touched it, though no wind blew. She made tea, poured it, left it untouched, sat in the armchair and stared at the wall. Her limbs felt foreign. Her thoughts ran like water down a sloped table, fast, uncatchable, and always away from the center. You were here before. You just didn't stay. She heard the words again. Not in the woman's voice, not in the child's, in her own. Somewhere below her sternum, something pulsed. That night she didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table and watched the clock refuse to move. Time was no longer a current. It was a pond, still reflecting versions of her that may have once passed by. At 2:12 a.m. she heard it, the sound of wood cracking, soft at first, then louder, a snap, then a long, wet peal, like bark being torn from a tree. She stood, moved without thinking. Outside, the spinney was silent, but the clearing that held the well was not. She stepped into it like crossing a threshold she didn't know she'd already passed. The well had changed, its wooden seal splintered. The boards lay scattered in a wide radius, as if flung outward by pressure from within. Nails gleamed wetly in the moonlight, bent, some still twitching with slow, insect-like motion. The wool was gone. No trace of it. No threads. No knots. As if it had been eaten. And the well was open. A hole of absolute black. No reflection. No bottom. Just a pull. Eleanor took one step closer, then stopped. The air around the well hummed, not sound but vibration. Her teeth ached. Her spine stiffened. Somewhere deep in the dark, she thought she saw movement. Then, a voice, from below, familiar, broken. Eleanor, a whisper, her own name, spoken in her voice, and then, again, softer, closer. You left me down here. Chapter 7. Through the third door. The Spinney Never Sleeps. The trail was not there yesterday. Of that, Eleanor was certain. It wound crookedly from the edge of her garden, past the open gate, and deep into the spinney. No animal had made it. No human foot had worn it down. It was marked not by prints, but by a pattern, intentional, precise, almost ceremonial. Small white mushrooms grew at exact intervals, some crushed under something heavy, others gently tilted as if watching. Feathers dotted the path between them, thin, mottled gray and black, placed one at a time, alternating sides like breadcrumbs laid by a hand with a sense of symmetry, but no sense of mercy. The woods were darker today. The trees didn't just lean, they seemed to close. Eleanor walked anyway. She no longer questioned her movements. She no longer asked if she was the one making them. The idea of will had begun to dissolve, like sugar dropped into warm tea. What frightened her now wasn't being led. It was how familiar the trail felt. She didn't remember taking it before, but her body responded like it did. Her knees bent instinctively at each slope. Her hands reached out just before each branch could scrape her face. She ducked, turned, pivoted, not consciously but smoothly, fluidly, like a dance practiced in another life. Something long buried in her moved with rhythm. The trail ended in a clearing she did not recognize and yet did not find. Surprising. The trees formed a ring, twisted branches knotted overhead like a crown of antlers. In the center stood a rotting beech tree, wider than a silo, its bark flaking in strips, oozing sap the color of spoiled milk. Carved into the trunk was a door, not built into it, not hinged. Carved. Crude, childlike, uneven, yet perfect in its shape. It had no handle, no keyhole, just 3 deep slashes across the wood, like claw marks or a tally. Eleanor raised her hand and placed her palm flat against the center of the door. The wood shivered beneath her skin. Then it opened, not outward or inward, but away, as if sucked into itself. The smell that emerged was not of decay. It was sterile, familiar. Linoleum and bleach, apartment hallways, distant traffic, the muffled hum of city life, distorted by distance. Eleanor stepped inside. The stairwell spiraled down, narrow, claustrophobic, made of stone slick with moisture. A thin green light lined the walls, faint as fungus, but enough to see by. Each step creaked, not with age, but with reluctance, as if the stairs themselves resented being touched. She descended. The deeper she went, the quieter everything became. No wind, no heartbeat, not even the sound of her breath. A suspension of all motion, a pocket of time unpinned from the world above. She could not say how long she walked. Eventually the steps ended, and the door appeared. It was not carved this time. It was her door. Apartment 4B. Black paint chipped at the corners, the peephole ringed with a faint smear of brass polish. The door frame was warped slightly from the winter. She forgot to fix the seal. Her hand hesitated over the knob. When she opened it, she felt a weight shift behind her, like something stepping back into shadow. She walked in. And it was her flat. Exactly. The same faded rugs, the leaning bookshelf, the window that never opened quite right, everything where she had left it or believed she had, except vines. They grew along the walls in curving lines, coiling like veins. Pale green and soft, not like any plant she'd seen before. They throbbed subtly with a slow pulse, like breathing. From floor to ceiling they climbed, some wrapping furniture legs, others emerging from cracks in the walls like they had always been there, merely sleeping. Eleanor stepped inside and the air changed. It was warmer here, and not just physically. There was a sense of embrace, a welcome. Her eyes burned, unbidden tears surfacing, not from fear, but from memory, because it smelled like home. Not just her flat, not just the space, but her life, her before. She wandered through the rooms, touching objects with careful fingers. A cracked coffee mug with the faded image of a cartoon owl. Her coat hanging in the hallway, still dusted with flour from the last time she baked. A book open on the couch, spine folded backwards. All correct. All wrong. Because she had not brought these things. She had not recreated this. She had not imagined or summoned. It had remembered her. The realization sunk in slow, like drowning in syrup. This place didn't copy her life. It held it, some version of it. Frozen, preserved, offered. She ran her fingers along the bookshelf. A slip of paper stuck out between 2 titles. Her old journal. She pulled it free. Inside pages she had never written. I left something here. Not just him, me. She turned another page. It opens from the inside because it never closed. You closed your eyes. That's all. Another page. You never left. You only woke up. She felt herself sway, like something inside had cracked, not from pressure, but from acknowledgement. Behind her, a door creaked open. Not the front door. A third one. In her real flat, there had only ever been 2, bathroom and bedroom. But now in the hallway, just past the coat hook, there was a third door, slightly ajar. Eleanor approached it slowly. The vines were denser here, thicker, pulsing faster. She pushed it open. Inside, the room was small, just a single chair in the center. And in the chair, herself, or something like her. Eyes closed, hands folded in her lap, skin a little paler, breathing slow and shallow, a peaceful version of herself, unmoving, as if in a coma or a chrysalis. Eleanor did not scream. She did not move, because her reflection, the one she had begun to distrust, the one that lagged and smiled on its own, now stood behind the sleeping figure, watching Eleanor, smiling, its head tilted, its hand lifted in a slow gesture, not a wave, a welcome. Chapter 8. The Quiet Man. The Spinney Never Sleeps. He did not arrive with sound. No creaking, no shifting shadows, no wind to signal his entry. But each night, sometime between the hours when logic surrenders and the mind loosens its grip, he was there, seated, watching. The first time Eleanor awoke with the sense of being observed. Not the vague paranoia that comes from nightmares or creaking floors, but something else, something precise. Her eyes opened into darkness, her breath shallow and caught in her chest. And he was there, across the room, in the chair by the window, the man in the moss, still, composed, arms resting on the sides of the chair like roots anchored into the fabric. His shoulders hunched slightly forward, his back not quite touching the seat, as if he didn't trust it to hold him, or as if he'd never sat like this before. His suit, always damp, shone dully in the moonlight, filtering through the warped glass. But it was the face that held her. Always the face, or the lack of one, where eyes should have been, whole, not sockets, not wounds, but black voids. Spaces that consumed light. They didn't blink, didn't shimmer, didn't even suggest anything behind them. Just dark, cavernous impressions, like thumbprints pressed into damp clay. And yet somehow she knew he was watching her, not seeing her, knowing her. Each night he returned, never moving, never speaking. And Eleanor never screamed, because the scream, she discovered, was no longer inside her. She tried at first, that second night, when she awoke to him once again, seated silently across from her, she forced herself to rise. Her body obeyed slowly, like the air had turned to syrup. Her voice trembled up from her lungs and stopped just behind her tongue, where it grew thick and heavy, then vanished. No sound, not even a whisper. She mouthed words. Who are you? What do you want? What are you? But the man in the moss only tilted his head slightly, and the room seemed to inhale. Just once. He did not answer. But he told her everything. Without speaking, without gesture. Each night that followed, Eleanor understood more. Not with her mind, but with something deeper, something bone deep. Some part of her she hadn't used in years. Something atrophied. A muscle for understanding the unspeakable. By the fifth night, she stopped trying to move. She would wake and find him there and lie still, heartbeat barely stirring. Her skin would tingle with cold, and her fingers twitch against the sheets. But she stayed still, because she had come to understand that he wasn't arriving. He was waiting, for her to realize what he already knew, that the house, the woods, the well, it was all memory. Or maybe it was something older than memory, something that used memory, bent it, hid in it, wore it like a mask. And the photographs weren't relics of what had happened. They were instructions. Or worse, warnings. On the sixth night, she found the photographs again. She had locked them away in the cupboard beneath the stairs after the day of the well, hoping that if she didn't look at them, they would lose their shape. But when she opened the cupboard, the shoebox was gone. In its place, a stack of photos laid out in a perfect line across the floorboards, one after another. Eleanor, bending to pick mushrooms along the trail. Eleanor stepping through the beech tree's doorway. Eleanor staring at the version of herself asleep in the chair. But these images were not blurred, not aged. They were new, fresh. The white Polaroid edges still damp in the corners. Some of them were from angles she couldn't understand, taken from places no one could stand. And at the end of the row, a final photo. The man in the moss, seated in her room, moonlight on his face. His hand was lifted, palm out, as if taking a picture. That night, she waited for him. She did not sleep, not exactly. She lay on the mattress with her eyes half closed, breathing slow, mimicking rest. The window creaked once at midnight. At 1:11 a.m., the shadows in the corner lengthened. By 2 o'clock, he was there. Same chair, same posture, same impossible hollows where his eyes should have been. Eleanor sat up. Slowly. She didn't try to speak. She didn't have to. And still, he told her more. She understood now. Not everything, but enough. The Spinney wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It remembered. It was built of memory, stitched together from choices not made, promises abandoned, doors closed before anyone asked what was behind them. It didn't punish. It preserved. Him, her, versions of them. Everything she'd forgotten was down there, in the dark, in the third door, in the hollow of the well. Pieces of herself, filed neatly away like old photographs. That was why he came each night. Not to scare, not to punish, to remind. Because she'd asked him to once, a long time ago, and she had left, but she hadn't stayed gone. At 3:03 a.m., he stood. It was the first time he had moved. Eleanor froze. Her breath hitched. The quiet in the room went sharp, brittle. He didn't walk to her. He didn't lean forward. He simply turned and pointed into the window. And then he vanished. Not with a blink, not with a flicker. He was simply gone. The chair was empty. The air stirred. Eleanor rose and stepped to the window. Her hands trembled, but her feet were steady. Outside at the tree line stood a figure. Not the man in the moss. A girl, thin, young, wearing a pale blue coat. Eleanor's breath left her in a soft gasp. The girl lifted her hand and waved. Not at the window, at Eleanor. And then, in the space between heartbeats, she mouthed something Eleanor couldn't hear. But she didn't need to, because she had said it before. You promised you'd come back. Chapter 9. Sleep like the trees do. The Spinney Never Sleeps. She began forgetting names. At first only little ones. The brand of her toothpaste. The author of the book she'd kept beside her bed for years. The name of the girl from the pub. The one who handed her the drawing. That particular thread, once tugged, unraveled faster than Eleanor could catch it. By the third day, she couldn't remember her mother's face. Not that she tried often. Thinking of her old life now felt like staring at an old photograph left too long in the sun. Colors drained, edges blurred, a ghost image where someone once stood smiling. She could still recall that a life had existed before she came here, before the Spinney opened itself like a mouth to take her back. But the specifics, the shape of her apartment, her job, even what city she had lived in, fell away like bark stripped from a tree. She tried saying her name aloud to anchor herself. Eleanor. But the word felt brittle in her mouth like it belonged to someone else. Someone not here. Once, while brushing her teeth in the cracked mirror of the cottage, she mumbled her name through foam and heard something else come out. Marla. She froze. Marla? Where had that come from? She stared at herself in the mirror, watched her mouth move slowly, form syllables like it had practiced them before. Not Marla exactly. Mora? Malin? She couldn't remember anymore. The vines on the mirror's edges had grown thicker. She had stopped cutting them back. She wasn't sure she'd ever been the one trimming them to begin with. It was her chest that betrayed her next. The feeling started like tightness, a vague, persistent pressure below the ribs, as though something inside her had begun to coil. Eleanor assumed it was anxiety at first, or grief, or simple fatigue. But the sensation grew stronger each night. Not pain, not illness. Growth, a slow unfurling. Roots, winding through capillaries, tugging gently, claiming. Sometimes she could feel them moving, particularly in the quiet hours, when the Spinney outside stilled and her breath came slow and shallow, she'd feel it, a tug in her sternum, faint and rhythmic, as though a second heartbeat had begun pulsing beneath the first. She began to dream in green, not forests, not landscapes, but veins, fibers, rings of time buried deep within trunks older than memory. She dreamt of sinking, not falling, not swimming, sinking like soil was swallowing her, and she was grateful. One morning, if it was morning, she rose to find bark beneath her fingernails. Not dirt, bark, thin fragments wedged into the nail beds. Soft and reddish, still fragrant. Her hands itched. Her arms tingled. She didn't clean it off. She no longer opened the cupboards. The photographs had spread beyond the shoebox. They were on the walls now, on the mirror, beneath her pillow. She didn't remember putting them there, but they moved daily, as if reordering themselves. In one photo, the forest had grown hands. In another, her eyes were shut and roots had begun to sprout from her lashes. She didn't look at them anymore. They weren't for her. That night, the Spinney came inside. Not just in metaphor, not just as creeping moss or quiet suggestion. It came with breath. The windows pulsed inward, then outward, like lungs learning. To exhale, the floor shifted with the slow weight of roots tunneling just beneath the boards. Her sheets became damp with dew. Somewhere behind the walls, something creaked softly. Not footsteps, sprouting. She sat up in bed and pressed her hand to her chest. The second heartbeat was stronger now, and faster. She tried again to speak, to scream, to expel something, even just air. Her mouth opened wide, and leaves fell out, brown at the edges, soft, curled inward, like they'd died before they were born. She touched her lips. They were warm, slick with sap. Eleanor staggered to the mirror. The reflection lagged again, as always, but this time it didn't match. The woman in the mirror did not mirror her. The reflection was smiling, a slow, indulgent smile. Eleanor opened her mouth again, desperate, and watched in horror as another leaf slid from her tongue and fluttered to the sink. To sleep is to root is to stay. The words came not as voice but sensation. A thought not her own, spoken inside her ribs. She clutched the sides of the basin, stared at her own eyes. The pupils had begun to green, just at the edges. Veins traced out from them like fine moss. You're not being possessed, something whispered. You're being remembered. The vines had breached the door to her bedroom by morning. They'd coiled around the frame in thick cords, pulsing slowly, dreamily, like blood beneath. Skin. They did not block the way. They invited. Eleanor no longer resisted. She stepped past them, the vines parting gently to let her through. They curled lightly around her wrist as she passed, in what could only be called affection. Outside, the Spinney had changed. Or maybe she had. The trees no longer appeared threatening. They weren't watching. They were waiting. They knew her now, not as an intruder, but as one of their own. She wandered past the gate, into the woods barefoot. The earth beneath her was warm. It pulsed faintly. The wind carried not sound, but memory, brief, disjointed. A whisper in her mother's voice. A song she used to hum in the kitchen. The clinking of dishes from a flat she could no longer picture. She didn't cry. She had nothing left to lose. No clear before. Only this. The well was no longer sealed. It gaped open in the clearing like a mouth, rimmed with fern and soft mold. A low wind rose from its depths, carrying the scent of sap and ash. She stepped to the edge and looked down, and saw herself. Not her reflection, not even a version. Just herself at the bottom of the well, curled like a seedling, eyes shut, skin pale, lips green. And then the version at the bottom opened her eyes and smiled. Above, Eleanor's mouth filled with leaves. Chapter 10. The Spinney Never Sleeps. The Spinney Never Sleeps. Eleanor, if that was still her name, stood by the window and watched the girl approach. Not a child, a woman, mid-30s, maybe younger, tall, shoulders tense beneath her coat, a suitcase in one hand, a letter clutched in the other. The same kind of letter Eleanor once received, cream-colored, embossed with a seal that looked like something alive if you stared too long. The girl hesitated at the gate. Everyone did. The gate was open, of course. It always was. Inside the cottage, Eleanor didn't move. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. The room smelled of peat and ash, of old paper and fresh root. The fire had burned down to coals, though no one had fed it in days. Time here no longer required tending. Her thoughts were quiet now. Less language, more feeling. Like trying to remember a dream before it faded, only to realize it wasn't fading. It was evolving. She had not slept in what felt like months. Not in the way humans understand sleep. Her body lay down, her eyes closed. But beneath the stillness, something within her remained aware, attuned, rooted. Sometimes she walked the paths through the spinney. Her feet glided rather than stepped. Her breath didn't fog in the morning air. Leaves didn't crunch beneath her weight. Sometimes she didn't cast a shadow. She had become part of it. Not prey, not visitor, warden. And yet there were moments, thin slivers of recollection, when something old stirred within her. A name, or the idea of one. A city street blurred by headlights. The smell of lavender and dish soap. Then it would pass, dissolve, and she would feel the quiet of the spinney curl back around her like a cocoon. The girl opened the gate. The sound was soft but carried. Eleanor tilted her head, just slightly. Watched. She remembered this. Eleanor stepped away from the window. Down the hall the floor creaked, not with her footsteps, but for them. The walls pulsed faintly with dampness, as though the house itself were breathing in anticipation. She stopped at the mirror. Not out of vanity. She no longer feared the reflection. It no longer mimicked her. The figure in the mirror smiled softly, welcoming, not cruel. A smile of recognition, of inevitability. A second Eleanor, not separate, not double. A version, one of many. Somewhere else in the woods, she imagined others walking paths she once walked, mouthing words she'd once whispered to herself in fear. She did not envy them, but neither did she pity them. Each came in their time. Each chose. Each returned. The girl entered the cottage. The door didn't creak. She stood in the entryway, blinking as her eyes adjusted. The suitcase landed on the floor with a dull thud. She held the letter in both hands, now as though it might tell her what to do next. Eleanor didn't speak. Not yet. She stood just behind the threshold of the hallway, in shadow, watching. The girl turned once, sensing something. She looked directly at Eleanor, and for a moment their eyes met. The girl didn't scream. Eleanor thought, "She sees me." But the girl shook her head slightly and looked away, as though dismissing a trick of the light. Eleanor smiled. Later, when the girl found the floorboard, the one Eleanor herself had once lifted in trembling hands, she would find the box already there, the photos laid out. Only this time Eleanor would be the one in them, watching, smiling, welcoming. The cycle never ended. Not because it couldn't, because it was chosen. That night the spinney breathed again. A wind moved through the trees with no direction, just presence. And at the edge of the woods, Eleanor stood, her feet half submerged. In moss, the earth pulsed gently beneath her. Above, the canopy shifted open to reveal a sky that pulsed, black, then green, then something in between. She felt no hunger, no fear, no ache, only stillness. And from somewhere far off, she heard the girl's voice calling a name. Not her own, but not unfamiliar. It would take time. It always did. but the woods were patient. From the clearing, something watched. It stood just beyond the edge, half swallowed. In shadow, its shape flickered. Man, root, memory. The quiet man. The one who didn't speak but told her everything. He was watching the girl now and smiling. The spinney never sleeps. It only waits and remembers.